about advanced DAX this morning and making an internet idea your own. But first, I want to introduce my colleague. I'm going to actually ask her to introduce herself. As you have questions, we'll be watching both the question and the chat feeds, so please feel free to type questions in there, and thank you. There you go. All right, Jess.
Hi, I'm Jessica Aguilar. I am a consultant here at 3Cloud and I specialize in Power BI solutions. I'm also co-president of the Oregon Data Community. I'm very involved in the local community and helping organize events. I received my master's degree from Washington State University, and I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, and my email address is below. So if you'd like to connect with me, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. That's the best way to connect with me. Turning over to Sharon.
All right, my name's Sharon Wallison, and I'm a senior consultant with specializing in Power BI and Power Apps as well, and where they meet. I'm a former CFO with a lot of experience. I don't like to say the number out loud. And I'm also a former CRM consultant. So I've had really strong experience with the two major data streams that corporations usually deal with, accounting streams and sales streams. So I blog at this first address here, and then you can also find me on LinkedIn and email me as well. What we've prepared for you today is a way to a methodology for taking a problem that you can't solve and searching the internet to make that and finding a solution and then converting that solution to something that will work in your business case, because it's really rare that on the internet you'll find exactly your use case. And so we've got a 5-step plan for that. We're going to talk about identifying the problem, searching the internet, tips for searching the internet, analyzing solutions against your needs, and using variables to debug your DAX and to test your measures. So let's see. So here's our 5-step plan. Identify your business case clearly. Search the internet for solutions. Analyze the potential internet solutions against your needs, and then you start writing DAX. You're going to try, you're going to test, modify, then you're going to modify and test, modify and test, modify and test. Sometimes it takes an hour, sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes a week. Hopefully not longer than that, although I have doubts about the one I'm working on right now. And then once you've got something that's tested well for you, you can create visualizations. So when you're defining the use case, this is actually the use case that we're going to use in our demo. So the client that we're working with wants to identify elapsed time, but they don't want to include time off. And so included in the time off are weekends and holidays in the red, and then also the times that they're not in the office. So the blue is the time they're in the office, the gray is when they're not in the office. So in the first case that begins and starts in a workday, no problem. But if we're talking about any of the other cases, those are going to cross over times when they're not working, and we want to be able to take these times in red out dynamically. So that's the case we're going to be talking about in our demo. But one thing I want to talk about, when you're defining the case as clearly as possible, you have to work with the end users and ask questions. And those questions, you just need to have it really clear in your mind, and you should probably be able to draw some kind of diagram, or at least write down a good solid list of requirements. And one thing that I've found is that I don't think I've ever seen when I had all the requirements at the beginning. So it's like you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know to ask that question, right? as you do it more and more, you get better and better at asking the questions, but you still there's always some kicker in the end. There's always a gotcha, is what one of my mentors told me. So with that, let's look at this. When I started thinking about how to search the internet, what kinds of things what devices I use to get better searches, I had a short list, but I went out to my colleagues because every consultant at 3Cloud probably does an internet search every day, at least one. And so this is our list that I compiled with my colleagues' help. First is KISS, keep it simple, stupid. You want to boil your search down to its simplest form, and a lot of times that's the art. You want to start specific, but know that you may need to generalize. You want to ask, I sometimes use, how do I do this thing with this tool? I use a question because I find that the search engines are pretty responsive to that. I also add in a product at the end of my search. So search this thing in Power BI, search this thing in DAX, search this thing in M. One thing, it's pretty important when you're using M, you definitely want to add the word M language. The search engines don't understand M, it's just too generic for search engine. If you have things in your search terms that are absolutes, they're mandatory, you want them taken literally, just put quotation marks around them. You want to watch the post dates, especially with Power BI, because of the monthly update schedule. If it's a really old post, it may still work for you, but it may require some adjustments, or you may want to try something new that replaces this old way that it used to happen because of an update. If possible, you want to stick with well-known sites. That's not always possible, and I'm going to give you a pretty solid list of sites that we like here, and I'm also going to ask what you guys like because I saw quite a few others. This is a reference to one of my colleagues smarter than me searched on the internet. How do I search on the internet? And he came up with this blog. It's a really good blog about using included are these special operators. I pulled these out because I thought they might be helpful. If, for instance, you know you're looking for a white paper, you might want to say that the file type is a PDF and then add your search term, and you would only search the PDFs. The same with the sites. If you know you want to look only on Microsoft blogs or listservs, then you can put Microsoft.com as the parameter. Or you have a certain word in the title or a certain word where everything that you have is in the title. Or my favorite, in text. This one's kind of understood, I think, a lot of times, but that search term actually is a little bit helpful. Another one that I use a lot of times when I'm creating a search term, trying to boil it down to that simple search term, I come up with two ways that it might be represented. And so I'll put the first search term and then I'll put or the second one, and then you can do a dual search. Or if you know that two things need to be in there at once, use and. Okay, then this is our list. I get it's in Spidey Vision. That's why we gave you the slides. But these are some really great sites. The last 2, 4, 5 of them are all colleagues of ours at 3Cloud, including me. I'm the last one. At 3Cloud, some of us blog, and so these are just links to some blogs from our colleagues. These are all colleagues that work with Power BI every day. Okay, so I have a really important rule about internet searches that you don't want to forget. That's why I put it by itself. Don't use DAX or M that you don't understand. even if it works. Like sometimes I throw it in there and it works, but I don't understand why it works. That's a problem. You should be seeing alarm bells in your head when that happens. So you want to try and spend you must spend the time to understand why it works if it's working. Or if it's not working, you want to spend the time to understand why it's not working, because that's going to be the source of where you need to tweak it. Because it's just because it doesn't work in whole doesn't mean that parts of it don't work. And you're going to see that in our demo. But you can't just, find something out in the internet and throw it in there and expect it to work. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and make just the, let's see, make another, there we go. Okay. Now we're going to start our demo. Jess, that's for you.
Yep, I got it. So you should see my screen by now. Do you see my screen, Sharon?
Indeed, yep.
Okay. So here's the data that I got from my end user. And we had customer orders, and we had the draft prepared on date and time, and we had a time approval date and time. And they wanted to know how long did it take for an associate to move an order from point A to point B. And they were trying to find, if they needed to hire more people to get that number up, or if there was someone in the department that was underperforming so they could address it and look into the issues of why that is. And so I got these, and they wanted to rate this time difference by just working hours, again, as Sharon mentioned. So we weren't looking at weekends and holidays, that didn't count against them. And we also didn't look at hours that occurred before business hours began or after shop closed for the day. So I took this requirement for the report, and I wasn't sure of a good solution. I didn't offhand know of a solution, so I turned to the web. And a second, I want to make sure I have the right screen here. So here I had, so I put in my search engine, and this follows kind of the cadence that Sharon was talking about. I asked how to find, and then I asked for the elapsed business hours between two dates in Power BI. And I went ahead and the thing about internet searches is it kind of becomes an art. It's not necessarily a science. Over time with lots of practice, you kind of like intuitively know the things that you should ask in order to get the results that you're looking for. And that search landed me on this site, acceleratorbi.com. And I went to that website, and let me just open that up real quick. I was able to look at the solution that Matt Allington, who authors that site, came up with. And I'm having a hard time getting to that site, so I'm kind of wondering what that's about.
Ruh-roh.
I know. Okay, here we go. So I went to his website, and I looked at his, his use case, and a lot of it met a lot of the same criteria that I had. How long has my ticket been open? And he was looking at a start date and an end date. And so he also posted this formula, and he posted a video. So I took the time and I watched the video, and I noticed that the video and the script that was written here was slightly different, which to me indicated that he had enhanced the code. But I went ahead and I typed in this code letter for letter into my DAX, and it broke. And that's when we're going to go back to Sharon and talk about things breaking.
Okay. Here we go. All right. Before I show you this next slide, I just want to go back and say Timothy had a really, really great suggestion on the internet searches that I wanted to bring to you, which is to include the word solved when you're looking on those Microsoft listservs. And that's a great one. Thanks, Timothy. Okay, so I put that in the solution and it broke. Why? Right? Why? Couldn't it just this once just work? That'd be really good. But no. And so when it's DAX, often that's a modeling. The modeling is different. Like DAX depends so much on the data model that if your model it is different in some significant way, the DAX is going to break. Their code was wrong to begin with. I mean, that's often, you heard Jessica's, did you say it today that the code in the video was different than the code on the screenshot?
Yes.
Sometimes you see stuff like that. And, probably that was because Matt found something that was wrong in his code on one side or the other, and you don't know which. Also back to what we talked about with the dates on the posts, the Power BI DAX or M are different from when the solution was created due to a product enhancement. That could definitely make it break. Also, user error. You might have noticed on Matt Allington's site, he didn't give a copy me kind of window. Jessica actually had to type in that DAX, and any of you that work with DAX every day know that that's not always easy, right? The syntax is very tricky sometimes, and so a lot of times you'll see errors that you made or errors that the author made. So that's another reason that it would break. And then another reason that it breaks is that it's not the right solution. You just picked poorly, but you kind of want to rule out these other things before you decide that, I think. When you're doing that, you kind of have to look at it a different way. One thing about this process is you can't just go out and find an article and copy and paste it into what you're working with and be assured that it's going to work well in your use. So you really have to think about stuff, and you have to kind of think about it in a different way. And this is a really good example that from what Jess worked on that where that happened. Oh, and you can talk about that.
Yeah, so I did. I wrote his script word for word, and it broke on me. So I had to go through each variable and to discern where it was breaking and why. And this goes back to where Sharon says, don't use DAX that you don't understand. Take the time to understand the DAX that you're writing so that when things break, you are able to identify it and correct it and not have to scrap the entire code because of one variable that doesn't work for you. And in this example, in my dim date table, I had a is workday, and I needed to make sure that my start days and end days were work days. So I had to use a lookup value that said if it's a work day, then compare the draft prepared on date to my dim date. And that's how I was able to get past that error that I was getting when I wrote the original script.
Okay.
But had I not taken the time to understand the code, I would have never figured that out.
Okay, and so now I'm going to make you the presenter again. There we go. There you have it.
Okay, so you should see my screen again. Are you able to see my screen, Sharon?
Yep.
Okay. So the first thing I had to do to get this code to work was I had to create a business hours table. And I just created a new table and I inputted just the hours, the start time and the end time. And I set my start time to 8 a.m. and my end time to 5 p.m. And then I went into my fact table, and here's the code that I wrote for that to get the elapsed time between these two time periods. So I created variables looking at the start time, and I calculated the selected value based on that business hours start time from that new table I created. And I did the same thing with the end time. And then I calculated the business hours per day and used the value function to subtract the end time from the start time and multiply it by 24 to get an hour value. I also like to add comments to my script so I understand what's happening, and if someone else looks at it, they can understand what is supposed to be returned. And so here it will return 9 hours because 8 to 5 equals 9 elapsed hours. And when I wanted to make sure this piece worked, I threw it in as a variable, and I'll show more of that in just a moment. And then I created some variables to look at my start time. I divided up my timestamps to date and time, so I split the column. I created a duplicate of the column, and then I split the column to just isolate the start time, the hours and minutes, and the approved, and then the dates. Just isolate the dates for this. And so I created 4 variables looking at that. And then I created my variable at the start of the workday. And again, I use that lookup value to make sure that these were all days, and to test to make sure that these were all work days. Under my return statement down here at the bottom, I'll just kind of highlight that here, right here. At this return value, I changed that out and I just put in start workday, and just something that I know a lot of people who are maybe newer writing code don't realize, but you can, to test your variables, you just pop it into the return value. And then I hit enter. And so for me, I flagged my work days as 1s and non-work days were 0s. So when I go back to my model view and I look at that, every day here should be a 1 because these should only ever show me work days. And I'm able to verify that that's true. So I'm able to move on with my code and test the next variable. So the next thing I needed to test was my first day of elapsed time. And I created a switch statement saying that if the start of the workday, so if this had a 0, then it was to give 0 hours, assign 0 hours, because we don't count hours on Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays. But if that wasn't true, then we were calculating the start time. And again, this is taking into account, so if the start and the end time are on the same day, we're calculating those hours. And we created all these criteria, and then we rounded the start times and multiply them by 24 to give them an hour value to 2 decimal places. And so we created this, and then we tested it to see, does this work? Is this yielding us what we want? Just the first day of elapsed time. And so I put it in my return value, first day elapsed time, and then I go back to my report and I look, and I'm able to see that the time from here, this on this record here, is indeed from 12 to 5 p.m. 4 hours, 4.78 of an hour. So this is working, this is true. And then I take the same exercise and I do that to verify that my last day of elapsed time is what I'm expecting, and that my full working days, which took the dates between the start date and added a date because I had already calculated the time for my start date, and I took my end date and I subtracted a day because I also had a calculation already built for my end date. And then my final variable was just adding all of those things together. So I took my total hours were the first day of elapsed time plus the full working days multiplied by the number of business days that they had, and then adding the last day of elapsed time. And then I put that variable in, and so we are looking at total hours. And then I went back to my visual, and I have now the elapsed time between when the ticket was open, and when it moved to the next stage. And I took this back to my end user and I was like, look, 66 hours and 82 hundredths of an hour. And they were like, great, Jessica, but this is where all the requirements don't come in. What's 82 hundredths of an hour? I mean, I can kind of do the math in my head, but I really would rather just see the hours and minutes rather than the percentage of an hour that it took. So I took this script and again, I did a search and on the web to see how do I convert a decimal value to an hour value. And I found a website that kind of gave me close to what I was looking for, but not entirely. And so I ended up creating this variable. And again, I had to test it out where I took the elapsed time and I summed up the elapsed time. That's what this measure here is, just the sum of elapsed time. And then I took to create an hour value, I created an integer of the elapsed time. So I just took that. So if we look at this record right here, number 6, that would have just shaved off the 9 and gotten rid of the 0.94. So integers don't round up, it just gives you that first whole number that is shown. And then to get the minutes, I took that elapsed time and I subtracted it by the time hours, and I multiplied that by 60 to get a minute value. And then I concatenated, so I separated these two items, the 9.94, I separated them, and then I concatenated them and put them back together. So I used concatenate, and then I formatted my hours to have two digits and the this separator, and then I formatted the minutes to have 2 digits, and then I went ahead and I returned my results. And throughout this process, I made sure that these were giving me back what I'm asking for. So I tested out. I put the return value as hours and then minutes, and then I went ahead and returned the results. And so with that, I was able to convert the hours from decimal format into hours and minute format. And with that, I was able to create visuals that the end user could use to help see what was happening, how their work was trending. And so here I have my, these worked against my slicers. You could slice by company name, and then I created this tree map to also kind of give a visualization of what was occurring in the business, and again, everything cross-filtered. I then created a bar chart looking at, and these are all made-up company names. This was just, I used a real situation and created testable data. And I color coded things so that they could see the highs and the lows, and everything would because higher numbers are red because that's bad. Low, as the numbers got lower, they turned yellow. And then I also created a time series where I was able to look at how they were performing over time. And so I was able to take the average and take the same steps, and instead of doing a sum, doing an average, and then creating a time value for that. And as you can see, in 2021, we saw a spike in the amount of time it took to get approvals. And so that gave my end user the opportunity to look at why. Was that because their department shrank and they have fewer people moving records from point A to point B? Or is this because people weren't, maybe someone was underperforming and it was driving the whole department number up? So it gave them an opportunity to kind of look into what was happening in their business, and also look at what should be an average. What were we doing year over year, and compare that and make judgments based on what they typically were expecting to see. And with that, I will pass it back over to Sharon. You're on mute, Sharon.
Thank you. I was sitting here talking to myself. I do that all the time. Okay. Um, so I just want to review our 5 steps to adapting a solution. You identify your business case clearly, and for us, that was to find that elapsed business hours between 2 dates in Power BI. Then you search the internet, and this was the site that we found, but you saw Jess's search terms. They were boiled down to something really simple. And I think that is a good recipe for successful searches. Um, you analyze the potential solutions. There were several solutions that she caught in that search, and some worked and some, that one worked the best. So you have to look at each one and evaluate it against your case. And then you heard what she talked about: try, test, modify, modify, test, modify, test, modify, test, modify, test. And one of the tools that she used for that was that variable, which I think is a really excellent advanced DAX tool. And then finally, when she got happy with the measure, she was able to create the visualizations. So so one of the tools that I found most illuminating when I started working with more advanced DAX was the thought of breaking it down into pieces, because when it's really complex DAX, a lot of times there are really definable steps that it's really, you can't do one before you do this other one, then the next one, and they're all linked together. It's kind of a daisy chain. And once so one of the most complex measures that I ever created, I was working for a chemical company, and we needed to translate dollar amounts for several currencies dynamically. And we needed to also at the same time translate units of measure dynamically, because some of the folks looked at pounds per US dollar, some folks looked at grams per or kilograms per euro. It was all over the place. And to do that really complex measure, I started out just really having to boil that down to the first step, and then the next step, and then the next step, and the next step. And variables lend themselves quite easily to creating each step and testing them. So let's see, I have another slide about variables. Here we go. So use a variable to create each step of a complex calculation to make the testing easier. One thing I love about the variables is that when you're ready to test it, you saw Jess do it. Below the return line, she started testing each variable by just swapping out the variable name. And once you've created the variable, the variable name that you created will appear in the IntelliSense. One thing about variable names is you do that VAR, and then you write the variable name, and it cannot have spaces in it. There are also some other characters that I don't think it can have dashes. That's why you often see underscores. I've seen a lot of people preface all their variables with like an underscore so that they know that it's a variable in the IntelliSense, because as you may already have discovered, a lot of times you start getting into a naming war where you've got a column that's the same name as a measure, that's the same name as a variable, and then it starts to get really confusing for you. So that kind of naming convention for yourself can be really helpful. So what you want to do is below the return line, you could put any variable to test it into below that return command, and then you have to put that into a visualization. And the visualizations that I use most often for that are tables, matrices, or cards. Occasionally, you won't have built, and that really only works when it's scalar, right? If it's returning a table, not going to work, right? Not going to happen. So one thing that I've discovered, if it's a variable that you can't test because it's not scalar, what what I do is I test the one before it and the one after it, and if I get a success, if I get what I'm expecting, then I can trust that the one that the monkey in the middle is okay, right? That the one sandwiched between them is all right. It's a relatively good assumption that, but so if you got one in the middle that you can't test and you get a fail on the third variable, that's when things get a little bit complicated, because then you don't really know if your untestable measure is the one that's broken or if the last one is the one that's broken. So then you might have to break it down further. I think that's pretty good on variables. And I think with that, I want to point out a couple of things that I already put in the question queue. That is, somebody told us that some of the links on the site page weren't working. I replaced some of those in the chat. Additionally, let's see. I'm looking at this question queue. Generally, I start adding comments for each step and then solve the problem step by step. I also use DAX Studio to test the variable. That's great. That's really basically the methodology I use as well. So I run 2 week on connecting from, yeah. I thought the first day I use the underscore prefix on my measure. I think that's a pretty good personal best practice, is to identify something that you can use. And again, you have to remember you can't use all characters in those variable names. Okay. And then I think what I want to do, I don't know, can we open the mics? Let's see. Well, let's see. We've got 91 people. I don't want to open the mics. I'd be glad to answer any questions about what we covered, or if you have other questions, we can answer those as well. Just type them either in the chat or in the question queue. Meanwhile, Jess, is there anything you want to go back and cover that you leaped over in time crunch worry?
I mean, I think the biggest takeaway was to test your variables one by one to make sure they're performing as you expect. And really the emphasis, I see that a lot of people attending today have just a little bit of experience with DAX, and that's something that I do a lot of trainings, and I see that a lot of people don't realize is that you don't have to just test your ratio or your return result. You can test each step in your variable one by one to ensure that the results you're getting are accurate and they're what you expect. And I think that's for a lot of people here, that might be a really important thing to be, an important takeaway for them today.
And I'll add to that, I use variables even when like in this case, it was so complex that variables really were the only sensible choice, but I've taken to using variables even when it's not that complex. And I use them primarily to document my DAX. For instance, if I was doing a gross margin percent, I might create a variable for the gross margin and actually call it gross margin, and then do the divide below the return line so that it's really clear exactly what I've got in the measure. And I find that to be a really useful way to document my DAX.
Yeah, and it keeps it really concise. I mean, there's kind of two methodologies. You can write your base calculations and put them in a folder and organize them that way. Base calculations can also be thrown into variables. So you could say your Your total is your total profit equals your total profit measure, and point to it that way, and then use it in that variable. But the one nice thing about variables is you can also create all those base measures while keeping it to one measure. So you can create the different pieces that you need to create that calculation and keep it to one measure instead of having 15.
Right, right. And right. Personally, I don't like to keep measures in my files that aren't being used in the visualizations, but I think that that's really a developer choice. So I end up using variables rather than creating base measures. But in the development process, I will use base measures, and then I use this fancy algebraic methodology in my mind to create that longer measure. So
See, and I take a different approach. I like to have my base measure folder, because then I know that any calculation I base off of that base measure. So if I throw it in a variable, I've already vetted it. I already know the calculation works. So for me, it's they work as a repeatable piece of code.
right, right. Oh, there was a question earlier. I apologize if I butcher your name. Mehdi offered up 2 other bloggers that he likes. One of them I'm familiar with, Ken Poles, and the other is Miguel Escobar. And I put links to both of their blogs in the question queue. So those, if you keep like I do, keep a list of sites that you really like. Those might be 2 good ones to take a look at. Also, when it comes to sites that you like, I really recommend subscribing to people's blogs or uh, video blogs. I mean, if you don't have a subscription to Guy in a Cube and Kerbal.com, those are 2 that I would highly recommend you go out to YouTube today and subscribe to those.
And SQLBI.com. That's a really good one as well.
SQLBI.com, of course, sure. I was just thinking about something that Ruth Posuelo at Kerbal posted. It was like a 30-second, video of something that I didn't know that was super useful for DAX, and that is if you've got this super complex DAX and you want to, and a variable name changes that's repeated throughout your DAX, if you click on one instance of it and type in the new name, it'll change that name throughout your DAX. I didn't know that. It's brilliant. Check it out. She's really smart.
So there's a question that came through. Is there a way to print a variable value to the console instead of using return to see the result in a visualization? And the short answer is no. It's not like SQL. So you're not going to just be able to run it in the data screen and see it. You're going to have to, again, I used a table view to test my code, and that's generally what you're going to do when you are testing each variable. Is you're going to have to use it as your return value, and then go back to your table view and see if you're getting the results you're expecting.
But it's easy to do because once you type in that variable name and get a valid DAX equal to that variable name, when you go to the return line, you can it's going to appear in the IntelliSense. It's really quick. And if you have, a lot of times I'll have more DAX that I've written below the return line, and I want to just test this one variable because I think it might be a source of a problem. What I do is I just comment out those lines. And one thing, this is another really good DAX tip if you don't know it. If you highlight the lines that you want to comment out and do a Control C, all the lines comment together, and if you select them again and do a Control C again, they all uncomment together. It's a really handy tip that I use all the time.
We got another question. Can you return more than one variable to test 2 or 3 variables at the same time?
That's a no.
It looks for a scalar value. So each row would have to have a single value. So you wouldn't be able to test because you wouldn't have a way to make, you're referencing it against one column, and in order to test 2 or 3 variables, it would have to be tested against 3 columns, which is not possible.
But that's where Jess's base measure methodology could really come in handy, because you could create, I mean, if you want to be able to do that, you could create all 3 of those measures as base measures and test them all together, and then throw them in, if you want, then throw them in as variables, either by referencing the measure or by just copying the measure itself and putting that in as the variable. Either method would work.
What you can do though in your return statement, you could create something like an if statement. So you could say, if this variable is greater or equal to this, then return this other variable. So that there is that possible, but again, your results all have to be scalar.
Right. I'm just trying to think of anything else on that I can think of.
You could also do the calculation as the return value. So I could have returned the equation rather than making that a separate variable. So I could have said, add this variable to this variable to this variable, and then I would have gotten the same return result.
And I think also very often the variables in complex DAX are they're sequential. It's like with my currency calculation, I needed to, well, I don't want to talk about that. Anyway, a lot of times they're connected to one another. So if you test the first one and then you get a successful test on the second one and a successful test on the third one, if you're getting a successful test on the third one, you know that the first 2 are still okay. Right?
And it reads it in sequence. So you can't do your equation as your first variable. You have to build your base pieces first, and then create your variable that calculates all of them together. So if it doesn't happen before, it doesn't exist. So if I wanted to sum up my working days, if I wrote that after, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be able to find it. So that definitely has to be done in order.
Any other questions? Let's see what we got here.
So Julia Martins wrote, in which case is it necessary to link the variables, like variable 1 equals and then variable 2 equals, return variable b equals variable 1 plus variable 2? You can't do 2 return statements, first of all. You're only going to throw one return statement. But you could do so, and you can create it like an if statement, or you do have some options.
But if variable 1, for instance, in his if variable 1 minus
Hey,
variable
Sharon, can you
2,
show my screen? I have an example of that actually.
sure.
Okay.
If variable 1 minus variable 2 is what you're looking for, then create variable 3 that just references those first 2 variables and return that.
Are you able to see my Power BI screen?
Yes.
Okay. So in this example, for my color coding that I did here, I created just one variable that looks at the average time. And all of that is average, it is a very simple calculation, but as you can see, it's referencing a measure. And I did a return statement, and I said, if the average time is greater or equal to 1, then I want to have this color, and I just use the hex color code. You can also put in quotes red, yellow, the standard colors. And then and so I said if, and so if it's not true, I used an if and statement. So I was able to say if the average time is greater or equal to 0.5 or less than or equal to 0.99, then give me this yellow color, which is again, I just pulled it from the hex grid. And then my final statement was if it's less than 0.5, then assign it this red color. And so this is an example of me using a, well, and I could have used more than one variable in this example, but you know, you can write a fairly complex return statement if you want, but it still has to yield a scalar value. So this column is only going to be red. This column here is only going to be yellow. There's not a, it's a single value that's being given back. And this piece of code isn't going to work as like you wouldn't be able to test this code in a table. This is something that I used in conditional formatting to create a function that gives me specific color changing patterns.
Okay. Let's see. I don't see any other questions.
I'm going to give it back to you, Sharon.
Okay. I think unless there are further questions, if there are further questions, feel free to email either of us or connect with us on LinkedIn and send us messages that way, however it works. If you do want to connect with us on LinkedIn, maybe in the request in the message, let us know that you were in this webinar so that we don't think you're a recruiter. So,
hey, Sharon, can you give me can you let me present real quick? Someone asked
sure.
me to show how to use that color code. I could do that real quick. Okay, and we're gonna show the screen. Okay, so I use the color coding in this bar chart. And when I went into the format painter and I was selecting the data colors, now it's going to default to red or blue or whatever your color scheme is. And on the side, there's going to be a FX. Right now, you have the eraser. So this, if I were to click on this, it would erase this formula. But what you would do is you would just click on that formula. Let's see if I can get that up. Here we go. And I formatted the data colors by a field value. And then I just use that color code measure in my measures table, and I just clicked on that and I hit OK, and that's how I was able to get those get the colors to render based on that measure.
That methodology is all over Power BI right now. You can make dynamic visualization titles that way. There's all kinds of stuff, but you have to have a measure behind it. So I use switch or if a lot for that.
Right, and remember also when you're looking at, let's say, percentage values, you're going to put it in decimal format, so you can't. So for this measure, my average time equaling 1, that means 100%. 0.5 would be 50%. So you're going to use decimal values if you're using percentage values, because it won't read a percentage sign. Okay.
All right. I think we're at the top of the hour. Thank you all for your attention. Please, let us know if you have any questions or comments. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you guys for attending.
All right, thanks, Sharon and Jessica. We greatly appreciate you guys hosting. Like they were saying, you all will receive an email copy of this recording in your email box around noon Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. If you guys have any questions for any reason, please feel free to reach out to myself or Sharon or Jessica. We'll be happy to help you. Feel free to follow us on our social media channels at Go3Cloud or just at 3Cloud, where you can see webinars or videos or upcoming webinars that we have showing. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday. Again, Sharon and Jessica, thank you so much for hosting and have a great day.
Thank you.